If you're watching this video right now, you've probably had the unfortunate experience of having a bad tarot reading. And I really wanted to take some time to dive into this because I've had clients as well who either have been regulars or first timers, and they've come to me and shared somewhere throughout the reading, well, I had this reading with somebody else, it was this really horrible experience. And then they will tell me some of the things that people have told them or parts of their experience, and I'll tell you it's horrifying. So I just really wanted to do a video because I feel like people are having this experience and maybe don't know where to turn, maybe don't feel brave enough to go see a different reader who might have a different perspective or a better energy for them, or just might be a better fit. So I want to really talk about what happens and why this is happening and what's going on behind it. The first thing that I would say to you is if you've had a bad tarot reading and you're really upset by the experience, first I would like to apologize to you and tell you that I'm very sorry that you had to go through that. I've had really horrible tarot readings before. That's how I started reading tarot cards. I got the worst reading of my life. I left crying, so I have been where you are. The reason I think that or I'm going to give you a couple of reasons or explanations why this might be happening so you can maybe understand your experience a little bit better. The first thing that I'll say is that there's a lot of people that aren't really trained. They're just not. And some people are just not well trained with the cards. Some people are not well trained with their intuition and their other intuitive or psychic abilities. You don't have to be to read cards, but if you're going to do that, you better at least know what the meanings of the cards are so you have something to try to rely on when you are working with people. And the third thing that I'll say about people not being trained is it's not really just simply about learning to read the cards or learning to use your intuitive abilities or memorizing definitions. It's really about learning how to deal with people. It's about learning how to hold space. It's learning to be self-aware. It's learning to have some sort of perspective on what the other person on the other side of the table is listening to you say. I have a video on here that was inspired by a horrible reading that a friend of a friend, I guess you could say, is who the person is. And the tarot reader just told them they were going to die and they had a year to live. And a year later, they're still alive. They're doing fine. But the trauma that reading caused that person, and the time that I spent trying to really help them understand what was happening, I mean, it was unnecessary and it didn't have to happen. And talking to her too, I realized that her tarot reader was not really well trained in many areas. So you don't just have to know the cards, you really have to understand people, and you have to understand that what you're saying affects people. You have to know when you're intuiting or getting information if it's correct or not. If you get a reading from me, I'll even tell you too, like I'm not great with guessing like times and like numbers and ages. Like that's not something that's in my repertoire of something that I'm good at. And do I get information like that? Yeah, sometimes. So if I get something that I know is not like in my particular wheelhouse, I'll say, hey, I'm just getting this weird thing of about maybe 3 to 4 months. Just want to let you know I'm not really necessarily good with timing, but I keep getting this over and over, so I'm going to share it. Take it with a grain of salt, right? That way that person is taking it, but they're not holding on to that information so tightly, like this is the truth, this is what's happening, because people really are listening to you. So it's very important when you're giving tarot readings to know how to do that. And if you're on the receiving end of something, I think that's really important to know. And it is questions that you can ask somebody too. Hey, what's your training like? How long have you been doing this? What sort of additional skills do you have that you bring with you to your readings, right? These are questions that you can feel free to ask. One of the things I've learned recently too is that when you go into any situation, whether it's a doctor's appointment, a tarot reader, a therapist, a dentist, like hairdresser, nail tech, whatever you want to go into, you don't have to just go in and just accept whoever you get. You are allowed to ask questions. You are allowed to interview. You are allowed to set boundaries with somebody. You are allowed to ask for what you want. You are allowed to say what you need. And that is the same with the profession of tarot readings and psychics and intuitives. So don't be afraid to ask somebody questions. Personally, I give people like a 10, 15-minute free consultation so they can ask me questions like that before they decide to book a reading. I think that's important, and I'm not trying to hide anything or, try to misrepresent myself. I want you to feel comfortable, and I want you to understand how it works to see if you want to get a reading or not. If you do, great. If not, that's okay. You call me when and if you're ready. I'm just always around. So that's one of the most important pieces of information I really wish people had if they were having a bad tarot reading. But like I mentioned before, I think one of the other problems too is that people don't know how to hold space. That's like number 2 on the list. And where I see this happening is tarot readers, not everyone, but the ones that are not skilled or trained or not really self-aware, what they will do is they will do a couple different things. One, they will listen to what your situation is, then they will tell you all about their situation in detail. Now, sometimes I will share in my readings a piece of information about myself or an experience just as an example so that you can understand the concept of it, not because I'm trying to unload my garbage on top of you, right? So you can really kind of tell if the reader is getting triggered by the information from the client. Sometimes they might say nasty things about your boyfriend sucks, you should dump him or whatever, because my boyfriend did that to me and blah, blah, blah. Okay, this is not your reading. It's not about you. It's about the client and what they need. And what they need is not what you need, so you need to back up. So that is one thing that I see that really kind of bothers me a little bit about holding space. The other thing too is really holding space, just allowing that person to be however they're going to show up in the reading. If they need to cry, that's fine. If they want to be angry, that's fine. If they want to be judgmental about you and how good you are, that's fine. You know, they can do and be whatever they want in that space. And as another kind of part about the holding space too, I think sometimes as a reader, and it's something that I learned a long time ago, and it was difficult at first, but once I figured it out, it was much easier. We all have different kind of values and ethics and how we live our life and things that are important to us. And so when we are in a reading, what happens is sometimes somebody might say something that comes up that we are very much against or have kind of a hard line about or don't agree with, or something along those lines. And instead of imposing our beliefs or our opinions about that, we have to just let that kind of go in the space and help that person process it and help them get the answers to navigate through that situation, no matter how we feel about it. I think a really easy, big example that I could use for people is cheating, right? It happens more often than I think people think. It's something that's very detrimental and painful for the person who is being cheated on. Sometimes it can be confusing for the person who is cheating on, like the cheater, right? Because sometimes it's just a fun free for all, and sometimes they're really struggling with their relationship, and this other thing will come up. And I know for a lot of people, especially if you've had that done to you, you might have a really strong opinion about it if somebody comes into you and says that. And really, it's none of your business. Your experiences are not valid in that situation. You really need to hold the space, let the person show up how they are, and refrain from judgment. What I learned is that everyone is not perfect, right? We're all going to make mistakes. We're all going to learn stuff. And sometimes experiences like this can be very profound learning lessons for people. Whether I agree with it or not, whether you agree with it or not, is inconsequential to the situation. Your job is to hold space and support that person and help them kind of untangle their thoughts, help give the correct messages from the cards, not the messages you want them to have, right? You give the proper things, and it's really about helping people work through that space. So I think that is another important concept about holding space that I think a lot of tarot readers don't do. I've heard people get judged pretty harshly for things, and when you come for a tarot reading, it's not normally because you're, excuse me, in a happy place. You're really struggling with something. And the last thing that you need is somebody coming down on you for stuff that you may already feel really bad or guilty about, right? So holding space is something that's very important that might be lacking if you are getting a bad tarot reading. The third thing that I think is important to mention is boundaries. This is another favorite of mine. I've learned a lot about boundaries because boundaries are hard to do. Boundaries are hard to hold and enforce. And sometimes we overstep, right? Especially tarot readers, it can be really easy to overstep, especially if you've had a lot of experience in a particular area that someone is going through. You might be so inclined to give them a piece of advice or share your experience with them. And I think it's really important to remember that there's sort of a time and a place for that, and how much or how little you are sharing. Some people will verbally just like unload everything onto this person who's already having a hard time. And they forget that people handle things differently. You really have no knowledge of the person that's sitting in front of you other than what they tell you, or, what your intuition is kind of telling you. You don't know their whole life. You don't know their whole story. You don't know how they have felt or what they've gone through. So, and how they kind of process situations. Some people like to go gung-ho, pedal to the metal. Some people are really more shy and reserved and uncomfortable. Some people have traumas and restrictions and limitations on how they can move forward through things. So when you kind of share all your own stuff or kind of try to tell people what to do or give advice in that way, it may or may not be helpful. So for me, when I'm in readings, I've had the unfortunate experience of having a lot of unfortunate experiences that have made me wise. But when I give people suggestions for things, I try to kind of stick with more general spiritual suggestions. Be like, well, these are some spiritual things that help with this area, and not necessarily based off of only my experience, right? Based off of like, okay, in general, if somebody were to ask a question, right, what would some things be that they could kind of go through and choose? And that way, they have options of like what feels good to me, what doesn't feel good to me. Like these three suck, but this last one, I think that might be doable. And it's what's really what you're seeing, and you have to give the suggestions based off of what you're seeing from them as well, not just what you want to put on top of them. So I think that's another really big area where readers can get stuck and clients can have issues. So be careful and look out for that. The last thing that I want to talk about that I see as an issue with bad tarot readings is the concept and idea of separations. Now, I've kind of touched on this in like a couple little areas in some of the other topics, but separations is basically separating your experience from somebody else's experience. So when you're giving a tarot reading, just because somebody says like, oh, my dog passed away, I'm having a really hard time with it, that doesn't mean that their experience with their dog passing is the exact same as your experience. So you have to really refrain from saying, oh, well, this worked for me, or you must be feeling like this, or, I'm sure this part was hard for you. And they might not have had that part. They might not have had that experience. Things might have not gone down the same way. So when you're reading cards for somebody, you cannot necessarily assume that somebody else's experience is your experience and that your experience is their experience. So that's another issue that I see coming up when people are having difficulties or having bad experiences with another reader. So I hope that was helpful in giving you guys some insight and some direction and maybe some things to consider if you have gotten a reading and maybe you're just feeling really crappy about it. If you'd like to have a better reading, please call me if you feel comfortable. I'm definitely available to kind of give you a better perspective on that, kind of switch some things around for you. And if you are a tarot reader watching this, please really make sure that you're aware of these concepts when you're going in. I understand that as you're new, you're going to make mistakes. I made mistakes too, so I'm not sitting up here telling you that it's going to be perfect right out of the gate. But, I think you do need to be aware of things that aren't necessarily taught in tarot classes. And especially when you're interacting with the public, it's kind of a whole different ballgame than when you're kind of doing it with your friends or by yourself. You're running across people where you don't know their histories or their backstories or, their experiences. And so the game changes quite a bit when that comes into play. So I hope that was really helpful for you and gives you a little bit better perspective. Until next time, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have an absolutely beautiful day.